The SEC for men's basketball was just an absolute beast of a schedule, especially for us as Auburn fans. We had quite the road to initially gain control of the SEC, but ultimately win the regular season title. Let's take a look at some of the best and most important games that took place during conference schedule. Welcome to the E2C Network, where the Auburn family speaks. Our content here and on our podcast network may tend to be Auburn sports heavy, but if it's orange and blue, it's what we do. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of our content. And thank you to members of our booster club like David Strain, who help produce videos like this. For our non-Auburn fans out there that may be tuned into this video, we are going to take a more Auburn-focused slant at this particular topic, but I think you'll find some value in it, and you could probably offer some pretty interesting opinions about this list that I'm going to give you for the most important games of Auburn's SEC schedule that ultimately determine the outcome of them winning the regular season championship. And a lot of that is in effect because of how good these other teams were and some of the losses and wins that Auburn was able to get at their expense. So what I want to give you is a list of 7, and I tried to really make it 5, but there were some games in there that I really wanted to mention, so I've made the list 7. And I'm sorry if you felt like that your particular team, if you're an SEC fan out there, got left off this list, but I really tried to focus on the ones now within the context of the game itself, but the entirety of the season, who resulted in being the most important ones and how everything shook out in the SEC schedule as a whole, but more specifically for Auburn's SEC regular season title. So let's start off with this. Number 7, the game at Missouri where you win 55-54. This is Auburn's most narrow victory in conference play, and I'll be honest with you, if you watched our post-game show after that one, I thought we had lost, actually, and I was panicking at the end. I didn't realize that we were actually up by 1. That's how nervous I was. There was a lot at stake at this game because at the time, it would have negated the space that had just been created between Auburn and Kentucky after they beat them and effectively kind of brought us almost back to square one. And it wouldn't have been an embarrassing loss because it was on the road and things like that, but it still wouldn't have been a good loss to take, especially in the context of what Auburn had just accomplished against Kentucky and nationally. Number 6, at Georgia, we get the win 74-72. Let's cut to the chase here. Georgia was a terrible basketball team this year. We all know it. You all know it. Yes, you got your football, but we're talking about basketball here. It would have been a complete and utter embarrassment. The only solace would have been that it would have been on the road, and Auburn had showed throughout the entirety of conference play that they would struggle on the road. Most teams did, actually. Not struggle is probably a strong word, but have more difficulties. That's kind of a common sense thing. You obviously want to have a better record at home if you're a good team, but it was exceptionally stronger this year on the road for teams playing in the SEC. This one would have been an embarrassing loss, but also one that would have not set them up for success later on in SEC play if it had not been for heroics from KD Johnson, who was playing his former team. Have a lot to thank for him for this season, but especially in this game. Number 5, at Alabama, we get the win 81-77. Very similar story here, except that you've got a better team. It was on the road against the rival early on, and there was a little bit of a scare there, with Alabama erasing a major lead that Auburn had in Coleman Coliseum and taking the lead themselves and putting a bit of a scare into Auburn. Jabari had one of his early signature games in this that made people realize, hey, this guy is pretty legit, and you'd probably credit him if he doesn't have that type of game. This is a loss for Auburn early on in SEC play that does not set them up well for the end of the season after the way things shook out. Number 4, at Arkansas. This is where we get into some of the more interesting games and more impactful games. The loss to Arkansas, 80-76 in overtime. Again, at this point, Auburn had yet to take a loss in regulation time. Their only 2 losses coming to Arkansas and to UConn. This Arkansas team has been very good all year and has continued to get better while still kind of being at the back of that group of 4 that mostly has been at the top of the SEC. Auburn's first SEC loss, and it set the stage for what was going to be a recurring problem in the latter part of conference play, failing to be as successful on the road against tougher competition in the SEC. It opened up the road loss wound for Auburn, and everybody else from that point, the Tennessees, and everybody else from that point smelled blood in the water. Number 3, at Mississippi State, the win in overtime, 81-68. Now, you look at the final score of this thing, and you're like, why is this one so impactful? Well, just look at overtime. We had to go to overtime to beat Mississippi State. Now, granted, it was in the hump, and that's a tough place to go and get a win, and Mississippi State has kind of been up and down this year, but not a team that you want to take lightly. If Auburn doesn't get the win here, they are not the sole champion. This is the second to last game of the year, and they almost blew it on the road. But what's also most important about this is they had corrected the road skid that had been happening that started back with the Arkansas game. So it showed signs that Auburn was able to respond to those problems that they were having. Granted, maybe against a little bit lesser competition, but they still corrected it and managed to put themselves in position to win the outright regular season championship. Number 2, Kentucky. We got the win 80-71. Early on in SEC play, this established Auburn as the leader of the SEC, knocking out the traditional blue blood. It also propelled Auburn nationally to number 1 overall for a few weeks. This was a great thing to do early on in your season to make sure you get out in front and create a buffer for yourself. Now, as we've already addressed a little bit, that buffer became less and less over time, but that does not take away from the importance of beating Kentucky on your home floor in early SEC play. Then number 1, at Tennessee, the loss 67-62. It's the final road loss of a very frustrating time for Auburn going on the road in SEC play. This is the biggest game that factored into the whole dynamic of that group of 4 for the SEC championship, the Tennessee, Kentucky, Auburn, Arkansas dynamic. Obviously, after the way things finished, Arkansas was probably on the back end of that, but you had the Kentucky Tennessee situation going on where Auburn had beat Kentucky, Tennessee had beat Auburn. It made for a situation where it was really just Auburn and Tennessee. And now looking back at the things in perspective of this list that we've been talking about, if Auburn doesn't win any one of these games, this is Tennessee's ball game for the SEC in some sense. So for that reason, it is the most important game, even though it's a loss on Auburn's SEC schedule. Before we go, I want to give you a couple of little stats that I want to take away from this that I think kind of magnify how crazy and awesome this SEC basketball season was for Auburn's perspective. 6 of these 7 games that we addressed were away games. 2 of the 7 that we addressed were losses. 5 of the 7 were wins. 5 of those games were by 5 points or less. Let that sink in. 5 of these 7 crucial games all were either wins or losses, 4 against Auburn by a 5-point margin. That's incredible. And a lot of that, as we already talked about, on the road. And then, of course, 2 overtime games. What an incredible season for the SEC, and more specifically for Auburn in SEC play as the regular season champs. I want to know from you now, what do you think were the most important games in SEC conference play, specifically for Auburn? But if you have others that you want to share as well, please do so in the comments section below. Let's keep the conversation going down there. If you enjoyed this type of content, please do help support it by smashing that like button. If you want more from us, be sure to subscribe along with hitting the notification bell so you don't miss any uploads or live streams. There's ways to help support our content listed in the description, such as becoming a member of the Booster Club by going over to patreon.com/E2C Network or hitting the join button here on YouTube. Become a channel member for $1 a month. Thank you for tuning in to the E2C Network, where the Auburn family speaks. War Eagle.